The scent of stale frying oil and cheap coffee clung to Ryan like a second skin as he unlocked the door to his dark, quiet apartment, expecting nothing but the usual heavy exhaustion of his diner shift. He draped a blanket over his sleeping wife Amelia, telling himself the growing distance between them was just the price of their grueling working-class lives, until her phone screen lit up on the coffee table, revealing a message from another man about a cheap downtown motel. He didn't scream or wake her. Instead, he simply stood in the shadows, letting the bitter reality of her betrayal freeze the last remnants of his heart. If the fragile, dangerous spaces between love, betrayal, and quiet revenge draw you in, stay with me. There are far more secrets hiding in the shadows of this story, and you won't want to miss how it unravels. The scent of stale frying oil and cheap black coffee clung to Ryan Mitchell like a second skin. It was past 2 in the morning when he finally unlocked the door to the cramped second-floor apartment he shared with Amelia. Outside, the relentless Seattle rain drummed against the thin glass of the living room window, blurring the neon lights of the liquor store across the street into smeared streaks of red and blue. He stepped out of his heavy, slip-resistant work shoes, careful not to let them thud against the worn linoleum. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. It had been this way for months, a heavy, dense silence that had slowly replaced the late-night whispers and shared laughter they used to have, back before the sheer exhaustion of their blue-collar lives drained the color from their marriage. Ryan moved to the kitchen counter, pouring himself a glass of tap water. In the dim light casting long shadows across the room, he could see Amelia asleep on the frayed sofa. She had fallen asleep in her retail uniform, the blue polo shirt wrinkled, the plastic name tag reading Amelia Cashier still pinned over her chest. A wave of profound, aching guilt washed over him. He knew he had been absent. The endless double shifts at the diner kept a roof over their heads, but the hours had built an invisible wall between them. He hadn't touched her, truly held her, in months. Most days, he felt like a ghost haunting his own apartment, just a shadow that paid the electric bill. Setting his glass down, he walked over to drape a knitted throw blanket over her shoulders. As he reached out, the screen of her phone, resting face up on the scratched coffee table, suddenly lit up, piercing the darkness of the room. He didn't mean to look. It was just a reflex, an eye drawn to a sudden light. Richard D. The motel sheets didn't smell like you. Missed you the second you left. See you Thursday. Ryan froze. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The neon light from the street flickered, casting a sickly, trembling glow over Amelia's peaceful, sleeping face. He didn't gasp. He didn't stumble backward. The reaction was entirely internal, a cold, hollow collapsing of his chest, as if the oxygen had been violently sucked out of his lungs. Richard D. He knew the name. He knew the man. Richard was the supervisor from the warehouse down the block, the guy who sometimes came into the diner for lunch, wearing clean, unwrinkled clothes and an easy, arrogant smirk. Ryan stood perfectly still, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of his wife's breathing. It was a sound he used to find immense comfort in. Now, it sounded like a lie. He looked down at his own hands. They were rough, calloused, dotted with tiny, faded burn scars from the diner's grill. These were hands that worked 60 hours a week to build a life she was now sharing in a cheap downtown motel room on Thursday afternoons. A surge of hot, bitter anger flared in his throat, begging him to wake her up, to scream, to shatter the quiet apartment with the ugly, undeniable truth. But he swallowed it down. As quickly as the fire ignited, it froze, morphing into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. If she could build a secret world behind his back, he could build one too. Slowly, deliberately, Ryan took a screenshot of the message, sent the image to his own phone, and deleted the notification from her screen. He placed her phone exactly where he had found it, a quarter-inch from the edge of a water-stained coaster. He retreated to the dark armchair opposite the sofa, sitting in silence as the rain continued to fall. The marriage was over. He knew that now. But before he let the ashes settle, he was going to make sure the fire burned everything down. Dawn in Seattle rarely arrived with a burst of sunlight. Instead, it bled into the sky like a bruised, gray stain. Ryan hadn't slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in the worn armchair, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Amelia's chest under the knitted throw. The apartment grew cold as the wall heating unit clicked off, leaving only the sound of the persistent drizzle against the window pane. At 6:30, the alarm on Amelia's phone, the same phone that held a hidden world, shattered the quiet. She stirred, groaning softly, rubbing her eyes before sitting up. Her blue retail polo was hopelessly creased. She blinked at the dim room, her gaze eventually finding Ryan sitting in the corner shadows, fully dressed in his clothes from the night before. "You're up early," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She pushed a strand of dark hair behind her ear, a gesture Ryan had once found deeply endearing. Now, it just looked like muscle memory. "Couldn't sleep," Ryan replied. His voice was flat, devoid of the tremor he expected. He was surprised by his own composure. He felt hollowed out, a shell of the man who had walked through the door hours ago. Amelia didn't press him. That was the tragic rhythm they had settled into over the past 2 years. The less they asked, the less they had to answer. She stood, stretching her aching back, entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband was looking at a stranger. "I need to shower," she said, padding toward the narrow hallway. "Inventory day today. The manager is going to be on a tear." Ryan watched her disappear into the bathroom. The water turned on, hissing through the old pipes. He walked into the cramped kitchen to start the coffee maker. The machine sputtered, dripping a bitter, cheap roast into the glass pot. As he leaned against the laminate counter, staring at the dark liquid, the memories of their early years began to surface, uninvited and painful. They had been young and desperate once, bound by a shared determination to claw their way out of working-class debt. He remembered the nights they used to split a single order of fries on the hood of his rusted sedan, making grand promises about the future. But the future never arrived. Instead, it was replaced by a relentless cycle of punch cards, sore feet, and stacked utility bills. He had taken on double shifts at the diner, convincing himself that providing financially was the ultimate proof of his love. He had traded his presence for a paycheck. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he had left her alone in this apartment night after night. He had slowly built the cage of loneliness that Richard Davis had so easily unlocked. The bathroom door creaked open, letting out a billow of cheap floral steam. Amelia emerged wrapped in a towel, her face pale without makeup, the dark circles under her eyes, a physical testament to the soul-crushing nature of big-box retail. She walked past him, pouring herself a mug of coffee without meeting his eyes. "Are you working a double today?" she asked, blowing on the rim of the mug. "No," Ryan said, the lie slipping out with terrifying ease. "Just the evening shift." "Okay," she whispered, already retreating into her own thoughts. She didn't look relieved or disappointed. She just looked tired. Ryan gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. A part of him wanted to scream, to grab her by the shoulders and demand to know how long she had been sleeping in cheap motels while he was scrubbing burnt grease off a flat-top grill. He wanted to shatter the fragile, pathetic peace of their morning. But the face of Richard Davis flashed in his mind, the crisp shirts, the arrogant smile, the steady daytime hours of a warehouse supervisor. A loud, messy confrontation would only give them the satisfaction of a clean break. It would make Ryan the angry, irrational blue-collar husband. He watched his wife walk into the bedroom to put on her uniform. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to break the silence. Instead, he was going to weaponize it. The gathering of evidence was not an act of passion. It was a slow, deliberate archiving of a tragedy. Over the next 3 weeks, Ryan practiced a form of emotional gymnastics that left him feeling hollowed out, as though his ribs were guarding nothing but empty space. He woke up, kissed Amelia's cheek before her shifts, brewed the bitter coffee, and then spent his hidden hours tracking the disintegration of his life. It began with the shared phone bill, an online portal he had rarely checked in their 5 years of marriage. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, before the diner kitchen became a chaotic hell of grease and shouting, Ryan sat in the public library, staring at the glowing monitor. The logs did not lie. There was a recurring pattern of texts and calls to a single number, escalating precisely during the hours he was at the restaurant, and she was supposedly restocking shelves. He didn't print the logs immediately. Instead, he bought a small black notebook from a dollar store. In it, he neatly transcribed the dates, the times, and the duration of the contact. His handwriting was steady, the block letters precise, resembling the inventory sheets he filled out for the diner's meat deliveries. It was easier to process the betrayal when it looked like a business ledger. The hardest part was the physical residue of the secret. One Tuesday evening, while transferring Amelia's laundry into the apartment complex's coin-operated dryer, a small slip of paper tumbled from the pocket of her jeans. It was a receipt from a high-end bistro downtown. 2 entrees, a bottle of expensive Pinot Noir, dated a Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. The total cost was more than Ryan earned in an entire 8-hour shift on the line. He stood in the dim, concrete laundry room, the smell of detergent and hot lint thick in the air, staring at the thermal paper. She had eaten truffles and drank wine while he was scrubbing char off a flat-top grill, dreaming of saving enough for a weekend trip to the coast. He didn't tear it up. He smoothed the edges, took a high-resolution photograph with his phone, and placed the receipt back into her pocket, exactly as he had found it. When she came home that night, she complained about her feet aching from the hard floors of the retail store. Ryan sat on the edge of the bed and massaged her lotion-scented skin, his thumbs pressing into her arches. He watched her face relax, saw the faint flicker of guilt cross her eyes before she closed them. She thought she was safe. She thought his quietness was just the usual exhaustion of a man broken by labor. He looked at her neck, at the collarbone he used to kiss when they were young and full of hope, and wondered how a person could look so entirely unchanged while carrying an entirely different life inside them. Every touch felt like a lie, but it was a lie he needed to maintain. He was a hunter, waiting for the perfect shot, even if the prey was the only woman he had ever loved. The digital trail reached its definitive peak the following Monday. An email notification popped up on the shared tablet they used for streaming movies. Amelia had forgotten to log out of her personal account. The subject line read, "Reservation confirmed, the Obsidian Suite." It was for the upcoming Thursday. The check-in time belonged to Richard Davis. Ryan copied the confirmation details into his black notebook. The puzzle was nearly complete, the perimeter drawn. All that remained was to find the final piece, the mirror that would reflect the damage back to the person who started it. It rained again on Wednesday, a fine, misting drizzle that coated the windshield of Ryan's 2008 Honda Civic in a layer of gray static. He was parked across the street from the Pacific Coast Freight Warehouse, the engine cut, the interior of the car smelling faintly of old fast food and damp upholstery. His shift at the diner didn't start for another 3 hours. He had told Amelia he was going to the bank and picking up groceries. Instead, he was sitting in the cold, waiting for a ghost to take physical form. At precisely 12:30, the heavy metal doors of the warehouse rolled open, spilling a dozen workers in neon high-visibility vests out onto the loading dock for their lunch break. Ryan slouched lower in his seat, his eyes fixed on the entrance. A few minutes later, Richard Davis walked out. Ryan knew him vaguely from the diner, but seeing him now, framed against his own domain, the reality of the man hit Ryan with a sickening, physical weight. Richard wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't some wealthy tycoon out of a soap opera. He was just a mid-level supervisor, but in the brutal hierarchy of their working-class neighborhood, that meant everything. Richard wore dark, tailored denim, a crisp, pale blue button-down shirt, and a clean, branded company fleece. He held a clipboard in one hand and a smartphone in the other. He didn't look tired. He didn't carry the permanent, heavy slouch of a man who spent his life standing over a grease trap. He looked comfortable. He looked secure. Ryan looked down at his own hands resting on the frayed steering wheel. His knuckles were permanently dry, the skin cracked from industrial dish soap, a fresh pink burn mark scarring his left wrist from a spat of hot frying oil 2 nights ago. A bitter, suffocating truth settled in his chest, heavy as wet cement. Amelia hadn't just fallen for another man. She had fallen for a different kind of life. She had traded the smell of stale diner grease for the scent of expensive cologne. She had traded his exhaustion for Richard's easy, arrogant energy. Across the street, Richard walked over to a taco truck parked near the curb. He laughed at something the vendor said, pulling a leather wallet from his back pocket. He handed over a crisp bill, told them to keep the change, and leaned against a concrete pylon, completely at ease in the world. Then, Richard looked down at his phone. His thumb moved quickly across the screen. He smiled, a private, intimate smile. Inside the damp, cold car, Ryan felt his own phone vibrate in his jacket pocket. He didn't need to look at it to know what time it was. It was 12:45. Amelia was on her lunch break at the retail store. The sheer, terrifying synchronization of their secret lives played out right in front of him. They were connected by an invisible thread across the city, entirely oblivious to the husband sitting 50 yards away, watching the thread pull tight. A dark, violent surge of adrenaline flooded Ryan's system. It would be so easy. He could turn the key in the ignition, drop the car into drive, and cross the 50 yards of wet asphalt in seconds. He could pin Richard Davis against the corrugated steel siding of the warehouse and beat that easy, comfortable smile off his face until his knuckles bled. Ryan's hand hovered over the ignition. His breathing grew shallow, the windows fogging up from his rapid exhales. He stared at Richard, who was now typing another message, still smiling at the glowing screen. Slowly, Ryan pulled his hand back. He forced his fingers to uncurl from the steering wheel. A physical assault would only end with Ryan in handcuffs and Amelia rushing to Richard's hospital bed, playing the tragic, oppressed lovers. It would make them the victims. He took a long, shuddering breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He reached for his phone, opened the black notebook app where he kept his digital ledger, and typed, Wednesday, 12:45 p.m. Lunch break contact confirmed. He started the engine, the old motor whining in protest, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. He had seen enough of the man who was stealing his wife. It was time to look at the woman who was going to pay for it. The bell above the door of Clementine's bakery chimed with a cheerful, brassy ring, entirely at odds with the leaden weight in Ryan's chest. He stepped out of the relentless Seattle drizzle and into a space that smelled fiercely of melting butter, toasted almonds, and rising yeast. It was a suffocatingly warm, comforting scent, a sharp contrast to the cold, sterile reality of the secret he carried in his jacket pocket. It was Friday morning, his one day off from the diner. He stood near the entrance, shaking the water from his umbrella, his eyes scanning the glass display cases filled with perfectly dusted pastries. Behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine with practiced efficiency, was Jessica Kim. Ryan recognized her from the brief, casual investigations he had done online, but seeing her in person felt like a physical blow. She wore a flour-dusted canvas apron over a simple, dark green sweater. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, secured with a wooden pin, and a smudge of powdered sugar dusted her left cheek. She looked tired, her shoulders carrying the familiar, subtle stoop of someone who spent 8 hours a day on her feet, but there was a profound, quiet gentleness to her movements. "Good morning," she said, looking up as Ryan approached the counter. Her smile was easy, genuine, and utterly unguarded. "Morning," Ryan replied. His voice felt like gravel in his throat. He cleared it, staring down at the rows of croissants to avoid looking directly into her eyes. "Just a large black coffee, please. And one of those almond danishes." "Sure thing," Jessica said. She turned to the coffee urn, her hands moving with the same blue-collar rhythm Ryan knew so well. As she reached for a paper cup, Ryan's gaze fell to her left hand. A modest, gold wedding band caught the warm, amber light of the bakery. It was a simple ring, scratched from years of manual labor. Ryan's own ring felt suddenly heavy on his finger, a matching shackle. They were in the same club, he and Jessica. They were the ones left behind, the ones working the grueling shifts to maintain the foundations of homes that were currently burning to the ground behind their backs. "Terrible weather out there today," Jessica offered conversationally, placing the hot cup on the counter and using a pair of metal tongs to slide the Danish into a white paper bag. "Makes you just want to stay in bed all day, doesn't it?" Ryan felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. Stay in bed. He thought of the Thursday afternoon receipt, the confirmation email for the downtown motel, the pristine, arrogant smile of Richard Davis. He wondered if Richard ever thought about the woman bagging pastries to help pay their mortgage while he was unbuttoning Amelia's retail uniform. "Yeah," Ryan managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "It really does." He pulled a crumpled $10 bill from his wallet and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly as she took the money. Her hands were warm and rough, a worker's hands, just like his. "Keep the change," he said quickly, unable to stand the proximity any longer. He needed to leave. He was suddenly overwhelmed by the grotesque unfairness of it all. He had come here to put a face to the name, to solidify his plan, to ensure the envelope he was preparing would reach the right target. But looking at Jessica, he realized the horrific truth of his revenge. When he handed her the evidence, he wouldn't just be punishing Richard and Amelia, He would be executing this woman's heart. "Thank you," Jessica smiled, folding the top of the paper bag. "Have a good rest of your day. Stay dry out there." "You too," Ryan murmured. He took his coffee and pastry, turning away before she could see the profound sorrow pooling in his eyes. He walked back out into the freezing rain, the bell chiming happily behind him, leaving the oblivious woman to her flour and her peace, knowing exactly how many days she had left before he tore her world apart. The white paper cartons of cheap lo mein and sweet and sour pork sat like an unwanted centerpiece on the scarred laminate of their tiny dining table. Friday nights used to be their sanctuary, a brief window where the crushing weight of their minimum-wage lives was temporarily suspended by grease, sodium, and the warmth of each other's presence. Tonight, the apartment felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with the smell of MSG and the deafening roar of things left unsaid. Ryan pushed a piece of broccoli around his paper plate with a plastic fork. Across the table, Amelia chewed slowly, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She had showered after her retail shift, changing into an oversized, faded college t-shirt. She looked soft, familiar, and entirely alien. "Inventory was a nightmare today," Amelia said, breaking the silence. Her voice was flat, carrying the practiced exhaustion she always wore home. "Todd wants everything recounted by Monday. I swear, the man thrives on making us miserable." "That's rough," Ryan replied. The words tasted like ash. He took a sip of tap water, his eyes tracking the subtle movements of her hands. He noticed, with a cold, clinical detachment, that she had placed her phone face down near her water glass. It was a small, seemingly insignificant gesture, but to a man who had spent the last 3 weeks mapping the geography of her deceit, it was a screaming siren. Face down meant she couldn't afford for the screen to light up with a preview message. Face down meant Richard. "How was the diner?" she asked, not looking at him. She reached for the carton of rice. "The usual," Ryan said, his voice terrifyingly steady. "Burned a few burgers, yelled at the new dishwasher, survived." He watched her nod, accepting the lie without a second thought. She relied on his exhaustion. She needed him to be the tired, beaten-down line cook, too drained to notice the expensive perfume she occasionally forgot to wash off, or the way she instinctively guarded her phone. Her entire secret life was built on the foundation of his blind trust. "Are you off this weekend?" Ryan asked casually, keeping his gaze focused on his plate. Amelia hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, a microscopic pause in her breathing, but Ryan caught it. "I have to cover a half shift tomorrow morning," she said smoothly, finally meeting his eyes with practiced innocence. "But I'm free on Sunday, maybe we could just sleep in." Ryan thought about the black notebook in his pocket. He thought about the text message log that showed an hour-long phone call scheduled between Amelia and Richard for tomorrow morning at 9. She wasn't covering a shift. She was carving out time for him. "Sounds good," Ryan murmured, forcing a small, tired smile. "We both need the rest." The lie hung in the air between them, heavy and rotting. Ryan looked at the woman he had promised to love for the rest of his life, realizing that the opposite of love wasn't hate. It was this. It was sitting 3 feet away from her, watching her breathe, watching her lie, and feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, dark anticipation for the moment her world would collapse. He didn't want to scream anymore. The anger had crystallized into something sharp and precise. He ate the rest of his cold dinner in silence, playing the part of the oblivious, exhausted husband perfectly, knowing that every bite brought him one day closer to delivering the envelope. The local public library smelled of industrial floor wax and old paper, a sterile, quiet sanctuary that felt entirely disconnected from the rotting wreckage of Ryan's life. He sat at a corner computer terminal, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, casting long, harsh shadows over the keyboard. The screen displayed a compiled document, 12 pages of call logs, transcribed text messages, and the damning, high-resolution photograph of the reservation confirmation for the Obsidian Suite. He clicked the mouse. He pressed print. The heavy, gray machine in the center of the room whirred to life. Ryan stood by the output tray, watching the pages slide out one by one. With every sheet that dropped, the secret transitioned from a digital ghost into a physical, undeniable reality. He gathered the warm papers, his rough, calloused hands leaving faint, greasy thumbprints on the pristine white margins. Back in his rusted Civic, parked under the amber glow of a flickering street lamp, He laid the pages across the passenger seat. He had purchased a standard, unmarked manila envelope from a drugstore on the way home. It cost 99 cents. It was absurd, he thought, staring at the cheap brown paper, how inexpensively a human life could be entirely dismantled. He arranged the documents methodically, illuminated only by the dim dashboard lights. First, the phone records, a stark visual representation of time stolen from him. Then, the photograph of the bistro receipt he had found in the laundry room. Finally, the hotel confirmation. He didn't write a letter. There was no need for exposition or angry declarations. The silence of the evidence was deafening enough. But as his hand hovered over the metal clasp of the envelope, a paralyzing hesitation gripped his chest. He closed his eyes, and instead of Amelia's deceitful smile, he saw Jessica Kim. He saw the smudge of powdered sugar on her cheek, the gentle curve of her tired shoulders as she bagged his almond Danish, the scratched gold band on her finger. She was a casualty of a war she didn't even know she was fighting. If he delivered this envelope, he would be pulling the pin on a grenade. The explosion would obliterate Richard. Yes, and the shrapnel would tear through Amelia. But Jessica would be at the epicenter. She would have to go home to a man she trusted, look at the life they had built together, and watch it turn to ash in her hands. He was about to do to her exactly what Amelia had done to him. He was going to plunge her into a cold, suffocating darkness. His breathing grew ragged. The rain began to patter against the windshield, blurring the neon city lights into smears of color. He could tear the papers up right now. He could throw them in a rusted dumpster, drive back to the apartment, and confront Amelia directly. He could end his marriage quietly, absorb the agonizing loss, and walk away with his soul intact. He looked down at the top page resting on the worn upholstery. It was his handwritten transcription of the text message. "The motel sheets didn't smell like you. Missed you the second you left." Ryan remembered the burning grease at the diner. He remembered the bone-deep, muscle-tearing exhaustion of a double shift, taken solely to pay the electric bill for an apartment his wife was using as a waiting room for another man. They had stolen his dignity. They had laughed at his sacrifice. Why should they be allowed to protect their comfortable, insulated worlds while his bled out on the floor? The fragile empathy vanished, hardened over by a cold, obsidian resolve. He wasn't the villain in this story. He was just the messenger. Ryan gathered the papers, squared their edges by tapping them sharply against the center console, and slid them into the manila envelope. He folded the top flap over, sealed it shut, and pressed the metal clasp flat. It was done. Tomorrow was Thursday, the day of the downtown hotel reservation. The perfect day for a delivery. Thursday arrived not with a dramatic storm, but with a persistent, cold drizzle that turned the Seattle skyline into a bruised smear of gray. It was 1:45 in the afternoon. Ryan sat in his idling Honda Civic, parked half a block down from Clementine's Bakery. The heater blew tepid air against his damp jeans. He stared at the digital clock on the dashboard. 1:46. Miles away, in the plush, temperature-controlled quiet of the Obsidian Suite, Richard Davis was likely pouring a glass of wine. Amelia, having called out sick from her retail shift with a fabricated migraine, was likely standing by a window overlooking the city, wearing something she had never worn for her husband. The sheer, logistical effort of their betrayal used to make Ryan sick with rage. Now, sitting in the cold car with the 99-cent manila envelope resting on his passenger seat, he felt only a terrifying, hollow calm. He picked up the envelope. Across the front, written in the same steady block letters he used for the diner's inventory, was a single name, Jessica Kim, confidential. It was time. Ryan cut the engine and stepped out into the rain. He didn't bother with an umbrella. The cold water against his neck grounded him, a sharp reminder of the physical world outside the suffocating confines of his own mind. He walked down the cracked sidewalk, his work boots splashing softly in the shallow puddles. Through the large, fogged front window of the bakery, he could see the warm amber glow of the interior. The afternoon rush had passed. The glass display cases were half empty, the remaining pastries looking slightly stale under the display lights. He peered through the glass. Jessica was not behind the counter. The front of the shop was entirely deserted. Ryan pulled the heavy brass handle. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, innocent sound that echoed loudly in his ears, feeling completely inappropriate for an execution. The smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans hit him, thick and suffocating. "I'll be right out," a voice called from the back kitchen. It was Jessica. Her tone was bright, carrying the muffled sound of a heavy metal baking sheet being slid into an industrial sink. "Just give me 1 second." Ryan didn't speak. He didn't breathe. He stepped up to the wooden counter. The register sat closed and locked. Next to it was a small jar for tips, filled with crumpled dollar bills and silver coins. Right beside the jar, perfectly centered on the clean, polished wood, Ryan placed the manila envelope. He pulled his hand back. The moment his fingertips broke contact with the brown paper, a physical weight vanished from his shoulders, immediately replaced by a chilling void in his chest. The bomb was planted. The fuse was lit. "Sorry about that." Jessica's voice floated closer, accompanied by the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the tile floor of the back room. "I was just trying to get ahead on the prep for tomorrow." Ryan turned and walked out. He didn't run. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a ghost. He pulled the door shut behind him, just as he heard her footsteps enter the front of the shop. He didn't look back through the glass. He kept his eyes fixed on the wet pavement, listening to the rain hiss against the hoods of parked cars. By the time he reached his Civic and slid behind the steering wheel, his hands were trembling. It wasn't the cold, it was the absolute, crushing finality of what he had just done. The digital clock read 1:52. He imagined Jessica walking up to the counter, expecting to see a customer. He imagined her confused smile fading as she noticed the envelope. He imagined her wiping her flour-dusted hands on her canvas apron before reaching for the metal clasp. Ryan started the engine, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the curb. The silence in his apartment had been deafening for months, but the silence he left behind in that bakery was going to tear the world apart. The stainless steel wall clock in the kitchen ticked with a hollow, rhythmic precision. It was 6:15 in the evening. Jessica sat on one of the tall wooden bar stools at the granite island. The kitchen lights turned off, the only illumination bleeding in from the street lamps outside. Spread across the cold stone surface in front of her were the 12 pages from the manila envelope. She had read them so many times that the printed numbers and transcribed words had blurred into a meaningless gray static, yet the phantom pain in her chest remained razor-sharp. She hadn't cried. The shock was too profound, too absolute, freezing the tears before they could form. She felt as though she had been walking on solid ground her entire life, only to look down and realize the earth had vanished years ago. The sound of a key turning in the front door broke the silence. "Jess, you home?" Richard's voice carried down the hallway, rich and easy. The sound of his heavy boots hitting the hardwood floor was a familiar daily rhythm that suddenly felt like an intrusion. He walked into the kitchen, reaching for the light switch. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" The overhead halogens flared, harsh and unforgiving. Richard froze. He was wearing his clean, branded warehouse fleece, looking exactly as he always did. Handsome, tired but resilient, the picture of a stable provider. But as his eyes drifted from his wife's pale, expressionless face, down to the papers spread across the granite, the color drained from his skin with terrifying speed. "Did you have a good afternoon at work, Richard?" Jessica asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the warmth that usually greeted him. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant, easy confidence that Ryan Mitchell had observed from across the street evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man. His eyes darted to the top page, the high-resolution photograph of the bistro receipt, and beneath it, the confirmation for the Obsidian suite. "Jess, He took a step forward, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Let me explain. It's not what it looks like. It's a hotel reservation," Jessica said, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "For today. 3 hours ago, while I was standing behind a counter, counting pennies in a tip jar to help pay for the new roof on this house." She stood up, the chair scraping violently against the tile. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. The absolute devastation in her eyes was far more lethal than any physical violence. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had sworn to build a life with, and saw nothing but a stranger. "Who sent this?" Richard demanded, a sudden, panicked anger piercing through his guilt as he grabbed the manila envelope. "Where did you get this? Does it matter?" Jessica turned her back to him, wrapping her arms around her own chest as if trying to hold her ribcage together. "Get out. Pack a bag and get out of my house." Miles away, The neon lights of the liquor store flashed through the rain-streaked window of Ryan and Amelia's apartment. Amelia stood in the cramped bathroom, scrubbing her skin with a rough loofah under the scalding hot shower. She was trying to wash away the scent of expensive hotel soap and the lingering ghost of Richard's cologne before Ryan returned from his evening shift at the diner. She had successfully played the migraine card, sneaking back into her own home, feeling a familiar, sickening mixture of adrenaline and guilt. She turned off the water, wrapping herself in a frayed towel. The bathroom mirror was completely fogged over, hiding her reflection. As she stepped into the dark bedroom, the screen of her phone, resting on the nightstand, lit up. The vibration buzzed violently against the cheap wood. She picked it up, expecting a sweet, post-afternoon message. Instead, the preview text made the blood freeze in her veins. Richard D. We're exposed. Jess knows everything. Someone sent her a file with all our texts, the receipts, the hotel. She's kicking me out. Do not call me. Amelia dropped the phone. It clattered against the floorboards, the screen glowing menacingly in the dark room. Her lungs constricted, the oxygen suddenly vanishing from the apartment. Someone sent her a file. She backed away from the phone, her wet hair dripping cold water down her spine. The walls of her carefully compartmentalized life, the safe little boxes where she kept her marriage and her betrayal strictly separated, were violently caving in. She was entirely alone in the dark, suffocating under the weight of a truth she could no longer control, waiting for the inevitable moment the shockwave would hit her own front door. The hours between the text message and Ryan's return stretched into an agonizing eternity. Amelia did not move from the bedroom floor. The damp towel clinging to her skin had gone entirely cold, but she barely felt it. She stared at the sliver of yellow light bleeding under the front door, listening to the relentless Seattle rain drum against the window pane. Her mind was a chaotic loop of panic, trying to deduce who could have possibly known about the Obsidian Suite, who could have gathered the receipts, who would have delivered them to Jessica Kim. At 2:15 in the morning, the heavy brass lock on the front door clicked. Amelia flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. The door creaked open, and the familiar heavy thud of Ryan's slip-resistant work boots hit the linoleum. The faint, stale scent of frying oil and cheap coffee drifted down the narrow hallway. She expected him to call out her name. She expected the usual tired shuffle to the kitchen. Instead, the footsteps stopped. Ryan stood in the doorway of the bedroom. The apartment was entirely dark, save for the rhythmic flash of the neon liquor store sign across the street, painting his face in alternating strikes of red and blue. He didn't reach for the light switch. He simply stood there, his shoulders slumped with the permanent exhaustion of a 60-hour work week, looking down at his wife trembling on the floor. "You're awake," Ryan said. His voice was not a question, it was flat, carrying the eerie, dead calm of a man standing in the center of an empty room. Amelia's jaw trembled. She clutched her phone, the screen now dark, as if it were a lifeline. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. Something terrible happened. He didn't move toward her. He didn't offer a hand. He slowly unzipped his grease-stained jacket and draped it over the back of the armchair. "Is that right?" "Richard." The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Saying it out loud in front of her husband felt like an unforgivable violation, but the panic overrode her shame. Richard's wife. Someone sent her things, documents, proof. She threw him out. He said we're exposed. She waited for the confusion. She waited for the shock to register on Ryan's face, for the angry demands, for the shattered heartbreak of a husband learning his wife had been sleeping with another man. She braced herself for the shouting, but the room remained dead silent. Ryan walked past her, moving to the small bedside table. He picked up his own phone, checking a notification, his expression entirely unreadable. He looked at his hands, the rough, calloused skin, the faint pink burn mark on his wrist. "I know," Ryan said softly. The two words hung in the freezing air, heavier than the rain outside. Amelia stopped breathing. The chaotic loop in her mind abruptly snapped, the fragmented pieces of the puzzle violently slamming together. The way he had been so quiet lately. The way he had seamlessly accepted her lies about covering shifts and having migraines. The fact that he was looking at her right now, without a single trace of surprise. Someone sent her a file with all our texts, the receipts, the hotel. "You," Amelia gasped. the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The oxygen vanished from her lungs. It was you. Ryan finally turned his head to look at her. The neon light caught the profound, agonizing sorrow pooled in his dark eyes. There was no triumphant smirk. There was no vicious gloating. He looked just as broken as the day he had found the first text message. "I sat in the library for 3 hours printing the call logs," Ryan murmured, his voice hollow, stripping away the last remnants of her denial. "I bought the envelope at the drugstore on 4th Avenue. It cost 99 cents. Amelia let out a choked, devastated sob, burying her face in her hands. The safe, compartmentalized walls of her life didn't just collapse, they pulverized. The man she thought was too tired, too beaten down by his blue-collar life to notice her drifting away, had been meticulously mapping her betrayal in the dark. He had watched her lie to his face, kissed her cheek, and then quietly built the guillotine. "Why?" she wept, the tears hot and violent against her cold skin. "Why didn't you just confront me? Why did you do it like this?" "Because you didn't just break my heart, Amelia," Ryan replied, his voice finally cracking, betraying the immense, bleeding wound beneath his cold facade. "You made a fool of my sacrifices. You used the hours I spent burning my hands to pay our rent, to lie in a bed with a man who has never had to scrub a floor in his life." He sank onto the edge of the mattress, the physical toll of his revenge finally crashing down on him. They sat in the dark, separated by 3 feet of space and an ocean of irreversible damage, listening to the rain wash over a city that no longer felt like home. The neon light from across the street had stopped flashing, leaving the bedroom bathed in a steady, bruised blue. Ryan sat on the edge of the mattress, his forearms resting on his knees, staring at the scuffed floorboards. Amelia remained on the floor, her back pressed against the cheap veneer of the closet door, the damp towel still wrapped around her shivering shoulders. The silence between them had shifted. It was no longer the tense, suffocating quiet of a hidden secret. It was the hollow, echoing stillness of a collapsed building. "I didn't plan it," Amelia whispered. Her voice was entirely devoid of defense, scraped raw by her tears. "I swear to God, Ryan, I never wanted this." Ryan did not look up. He slowly rubbed his thumb over the faint, pink burn scar on his left wrist. People don't plan to end up in downtown hotel rooms on a Thursday afternoon, but they still walk through the door. Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling over her pale cheeks. "I was so lonely. You were never here. And when you were here, you were a ghost. You'd come home smelling like the diner, exhausted, barely able to speak, and I would just watch you sleep. I felt like I was disappearing. Every day, just ringing up customers, coming home to an empty room, counting pennies for an electric bill we could barely afford. I felt like I was completely invisible." "So you found someone who had the time to look at you," Ryan said quietly, his tone remarkably devoid of malice. It was a simple, agonizing statement of fact. "He looked at me, and I felt alive again," she confessed, the brutal honesty tearing through the dark room. "He didn't talk about utility bills or overtime. He talked about taking me to dinner. He made me feel like a woman, not just a roommate surviving on minimum wage. I was drowning in this life, Ryan. I was suffocating." Ryan finally lifted his head. The sorrow in his eyes was ancient, built upon years of unacknowledged sacrifices. He looked at the cracked ceiling, listening to the persistent drumming of the Seattle rain. "We were both drowning, Amelia," Ryan said, his voice breaking under the immense weight of his own heartbreak. "That's what this life is. It's keeping your head just above the water. I worked 60 hours a week over a grease trap so we wouldn't lose this apartment. I traded every ounce of my energy, my youth, my presence, just to keep a roof over our heads. I wasn't absent because I didn't love you. I was absent because I was trying to keep us alive." He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. He didn't walk toward her. The physical distance between them felt infinite, a chasm that could never be crossed again. "I know I left you alone in this room," Ryan continued, the tears finally welling in his own eyes, tracing hot paths down his tired face. "I know I failed you as a husband. I know I let the grind of this city steal the man you married. But when we were drowning, I just kept swimming. I just kept kicking, as hard as I could, hoping we'd eventually reach the shore." He paused, looking down at the woman he had promised his life to, seeing the irrevocable damage etched into the space between them. I kept swimming, Ryan whispered. And you climbed onto someone else's boat. Amelia let out a ragged, agonizing sob, burying her face against her knees. There was no argument to be made. There was no defense against the tragic, undeniable truth of his words. She had sought a lifeboat, and in doing so, she had kicked the man who loved her back down into the freezing depths. Ryan watched her cry, feeling the last fragile threads of their marriage finally snap. The anger was entirely gone, replaced only by a profound, debilitating sorrow. They were both victims of a world that demanded too much of them, but only one of them had chosen to break the vow. He turned slowly, walking out of the bedroom and leaving her alone in the dark. The relentless Seattle rain finally stopped just before dawn, leaving the city bruised, damp, and suffocatingly quiet. Inside the apartment, the only sound was the harsh, metallic rasp of a suitcase zipper. Ryan sat at the small kitchen table, staring into a mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He didn't turn his head as Amelia walked down the narrow hallway, struggling slightly under the weight of 2 heavy duffel bags. She had changed out of the damp, oversized t-shirt and was now wearing a nondescript gray sweater and jeans. She looked smaller than she had the night before, hollowed out by the absolute collapse of the dual lives she had tried so desperately to maintain. She stopped by the front door, dropping the bags onto the scuffed linoleum. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her silver apartment key, and placed it on the edge of the laminate counter. The metal clinked softly against the wood. "I'll have the rest of my things moved out by Sunday," Amelia said. Her voice was devoid of the dramatic, tearing sobs from a few hours prior. It was just an empty, practical whisper. "I'm staying at a motel near the highway until I figure something out." Ryan looked at the key. He thought about the 5 years they had spent in this cramped space, the early days of splitting cheap takeout and making naive promises about saving enough money to buy a house in the suburbs. All of it had been reduced to a 99-cent envelope and a piece of metal on a counter. "Okay," Ryan replied. Amelia lingered for a fraction of a second, her hand resting on the brass doorknob. Perhaps a small, delusional part of her hoped he would stand up, that the sheer finality of her leaving would override the damage she had done. But Ryan remained perfectly still. The man who had meticulously tracked her betrayal in a dark library was not going to save her from the consequences. She turned the knob, stepped out into the damp hallway, and pulled the door shut. The click of the latch was the loudest sound Ryan had ever heard. It was the sound of an ending. 3 weeks later, the Friday evening rush at the diner was a chaotic symphony of sizzling grease, shouting waitstaff, and the clattering of heavy ceramic plates. Ryan stood at the flat-top grill, flipping half-pound burgers with mechanical precision. The heat radiating from the iron was punishing, stinging the faint pink burn scar on his left wrist. He was working a double shift. He had asked the manager for the extra hours. The apartment was too quiet now, a domestic graveyard he only returned to when his body absolutely demanded sleep. He wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his forearm. Across the street, through the greasy front window of the diner, he could see the loading dock of the Pacific Coast Freight Warehouse. He had heard the rumors from a delivery driver a few days ago. Richard Davis had been fired, his pristine, arrogant life spiraling into a bitter, messy divorce that was tearing through the local court system. Jessica Kim had sold the house they shared and moved back to Portland to live with her sister. The blast radius of Ryan's silent revenge had been absolute. Yet, as Ryan plated a heavy order of fries, he felt no triumphant vindication. His chest was not suddenly filled with light. The revenge had been necessary, a surgical strike to destroy the lies that were suffocating him, but it had not cured the profound, agonizing loneliness that now defined his existence. He had burned the diseased forest to the ground, but he was still left standing in the ashes. He looked down at his rough, calloused hands. They were the hands of a working man, hands that had built a cage, dismantled a marriage, and survived the wreckage. He didn't know where Amelia was, and he realized with a quiet, settling peace that he no longer needed to know. The bitter dawn had broken. He was alone, he was exhausted, but for the first time in 2 years, he was finally awake.